Hi, I'm Julie Zook. So tonight we welcome Jennifer Bonner. She is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she is director of MAL, a design firm. Jennifer received a BA in architecture from Auburn University and then got her MArch from Harvard. Her work deals largely with the conceptual in architecture, and she approaches that work with a lot of energy. She has exhibited most recently at the Istanbul Biennial, as well as at the Royal Institute of British Architects, among other places. She's had her work published in Architectural Review and Architectural Record, among other places, and she has a forthcoming series of small books that she'll talk about tonight that she developed in design research studios with master's students at Georgia Tech, and I think continuing this work at the GSD. The name of the series is A Guide to the Dirty South, and there are going to be several of them. The first focuses on Atlanta, others may focus on Miami and New Orleans, and the Atlanta installment will be published by Artifice this December. Before returning to academia, Jennifer worked for Foster & Partners, and then as project architect for David Chipperfield, both in London. Join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Dean Williamson, and thank you for all the students coming here in the second week of school and lively attendance. And also thank you to the two students that I had a conversation with earlier this afternoon regarding my work and then the publication that's happening at the school. And Julie, thank you for taking me around today and entertaining me in Lubbock. First things first, I wanted to talk about business matters, and that has to do with the name of my firm. So, as we all know, the acronym is a 20th century Americanism, and it's in wide circulation. Americans love their shorthand. And this is what MAL looks like sitting in a sea of known acronyms outside of our discipline, ranging from governmental agencies and digital technology to best social media practices like OMG. And then here's MAL sitting amongst other architectural practices that also use acronyms. So as Julie mentioned, my former employers, Foster & Partners, and I think DCA, David Chipperfield Architects. And MAL uses short form as a way of allowing the long form name to change from month to month, or as our architectural interests shift for each project. MAL is interested in an intellectual project, not a formal project, which is why our architecture tends to look differently from project to project, and I hope that'll come through tonight. I'll show a selection of projects that hack typologies, reference cultural events, and invent representation. And so MAL stands for Mass Architectural Loop-de-Loops. It could also stand for Miniature Angles and Little Lines, or Maximum Arches with Limited Liability. So you can kind of see there's a project in each of these, and I haven't worked through all of them yet. And you know, we can just add a little C to the end and make it an LLC if we want to be more professional or look more proper. I'd also like to make a case for misbehaving in architecture. And in order to talk about misbehaving, I want to note that I'm not talking about the familiar scene of a little child kind of acting out in public, although I do have a toddler and it is on my mind a lot these days. In terms of architecture, I'm not talking about misbehaving in terms of like breaking building codes or being irresponsible. And I want to try to kind of work through these by showing a series of slides by other architects that I think are actually kind of misbehaving with their work. And so this first image is Max Scoggin and Merrill Elam outside of Atlanta. And here they've taken the notebook, like a composition notebook, and blown it up to be the facade of a library. located in the middle of a very proper Trafalgar Square in London. Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown play the game of the surrounding context, but if you look really closely, we see something has kind of gone wrong, and all the columns are misbehaving, and they're kind of clumped together in this forced perspective. Some of you probably know this project, the IIT Student Center. You go into this kind of stramp situation and you see what looks to be an unfinished ceiling. Again, a closer look, we see that Koolhaas and OMA have actually specified an unfinished drywall, tape, and putty look. So this is all intentional. And this is the oldest, earliest examples I could find of misbehaving. It's 1762, and it's a Piranesi etching of a fictional Rome in the Campo de Marzio drawing. And I think, the use of imagination to construct what might look like he's uncovering an archaeology, but without evidence. He's setting up a polemic. He's acting out with these maps of Rome. And then lastly, the Barton House. And these are architects from Mississippi. It's Mock B. Coker. They made a house out of cinder blocks. And isn't this the material that we make prisons and elementary schools out of? I think they're misbehaving with their material here. These are the misbehaving architects. They hail from the American South, Italy, the Netherlands, and South Africa, and they're questioning materiality, form, context, and appropriateness. And I argue that their architecture radically challenges the status quo and gains momentum in architecture by misbehaving. The next little part about how my practice works, I wanted to speak directly to the students about the realities of what a practice might look like when you start up. And in my case, I finished graduate school in January 2009, and this is the result of a post kind of economic turndown, and I found myself in a predicament as to how to work. So I'm just going to talk through some ideas and how the project's kind of evolved. So as you start out, you might be a one-woman band, and you might team up with others to gain momentum. So this is a partner that I worked with, Christian Stainer, out of Los Angeles, and we're doing a three-way Skype with our project manager in Opelika, Florida. This is Jermaine Barnes. So several of the projects I'll show in this series, and one specifically is with Christian Stainer. When you start out, you might try to rethink public art from static sculptures to active public spaces. And so we started looking at public art callings across the U.S. And worked on this small pavilion project that I'll show. You might start to work out of anonymous spaces. You don't have office space, you have your laptop, and you try to make kind of objects that don't fit inside of these anonymous spaces. And this is that project called Made in Opelika in Florida. You ask audiences to read fake newspapers. This is a lecture that I gave, public lecture I gave at Georgia Tech. Number 5, you form a band and exhibit work in U-Hauls outside of major art institutions. This is a show called On the Road Project LA, where architects exhibited their work, this is the band, in these 5 U-Hauls outside of the Geffen Contemporary in downtown LA. And you have to know that there was a show going on inside the gallery with much more famous older architects like Frank Gehry, which was called New Sculpturism. So we were kind of doing a demonstration project in the parking lot. Number 6, you might hang out in the mechanical room of the Istanbul Modern Museum on opening night of the Istanbul Design Biennale. This is French perfumer Christophe Laudemille, and we collaborated with him to tap into the HVAC system of the museum and pump two conceptual scents that he designed in collaboration with us, and this is the mechanical engineer putting it in. We were kind of down to the wire as to getting the project running. And then downstairs in the gallery space, we were really behaving. Here are our drawings on the wall, which represent our work on olfactory research and a set of drawings that were on display. And I think somewhere in here, where is it? We're describing what the conceptual scents are and the time release that they're happening within the gallery. So one of the smells was the Bosphorus, and another one was a pink gardenia rose, and they were on a cycle as to when they were distributed. Number 7, you hold book signing parties on the top floor of abandoned parking garages because A, you don't have to ask for one, and it's a free view of the city, and this is in downtown of Atlanta. This is the project I'll show you at the very end. Number 8, you rent green screens and make homemade videos to convince clients. At the time, we were working in Los Angeles, and so it's quite cheap to rent a green screen in Burbank. And this is for that Made in Opelika project in north of Miami, where we made a proposal. Again, it was a public art calling, but we always tried to flip it and turn it into an architectural idea. And these are our proposals for micro enterprises, which would allow residents to upstart businesses, culinary businesses, out of their homes in the side yard. Number 9, you ask guests to put on plastic boots at installation openings. And this is a project where I flooded a gallery on Hollywood Boulevard with 7,000 gallons of water. It was made with a single sheet of rubber, and it started leaking that night, and the boots were leaking, and everybody was getting wet. So, and lastly, number 10, you hire a food photographer to document hundreds of architectural models. This is a photograph by the photographer Adam Detour. It was just made this summer, and because I was asked to be the faculty editor of a book called Platform at the GSD, which is a book about the life and activities and student work of the school over the past year. And so we took our auditorium space and staged these 16 still lifes that were then photographed and become kind of the content and the chapters for the book. Okay, getting into the work. This first project is called 'Tis the Wind. It's a public art calling competition. It's a memorial to honor Edgar Allan Poe, located in Poe Square in Boston. This was a collaboration with Christian Steiner. And we were shortlisted, and what that means is you show up and present your ideas to a public forum. And we showed up with a big stack of newspapers and started passing them out. So in this case, the representation of a newspaper has been hacked. We make all these fake articles about the artwork. The paper's called The Raven. And in this case, at the start of the project, we are asking a few questions. What is the contemporary memorial? Shouldn't it relate more to popular culture rather than a kind of static sculpture, imposed likeness, like what our competitors were proposing? And inside of the newspaper, we put all the things architects do, diagrams, our research, our argument. And our argument kind of goes like this. There's several Poe sculptures and memorials on the eastern seaboard from Boston down to Richmond, Virginia. All of these cities claiming some kind of historical link to Poe. He studied at UVA in Charlotte for, I don't know, a couple of months and wrote something there. And so we look at these sculptures and say, these memorials and say, well, they're pretty didactic. They're all these sculptures and the Raven or imposed likeness. I mean, how many more of these things can we have? And so we propose something more close in line to the memorial at University of Virginia's campus, which is a sealed room. And we're architects trying to make architecture acting as public artists. So we really thought about the different ways that this thing could be interpreted, and we decided early on that public artwork needed to be robust enough to allow for multiple interpretations. And so we first started thinking about the interpretive model. When you enter a state park, it's a topographic model. We thought about it being quite functional. Could it be a pop-up shop with Poe-inspired objects? And so in the advertisement section of the newspaper, we were proposing to sell the telltale alarm clock, or green spectacles, pin the mustache on the Poe. And we're quite serious about this because, it seems like the way to get to the general public might have to do with something about shopping or consumerism. And we gave our client 3 different ways to use the space. It could be a sealed memorial that you only look at objects inside. It could be a bus stop where you could actually have the public going into the space, or it could function as a store that had an open and closing kind of hours. We also wrote letters to the editor against our scheme, so kind of calling out our own criticisms of the project. It will block a view, it's awkwardly located in the post square, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of materiality, we were looking at slumped glass as a kind of blurry view of these objects. And you all know how the story goes. This was the winner. And once again, Poe's likeness is then there as a sculpture today. But we found something online which we thought was pretty entertaining. They've taken our idea for consumerism and they've made a Poe bobblehead that was for sale to try to fundraise for the project. So I guess some of our ideas were stolen, and that we're very flattered. Okay, in this body of work, I would like to argue for a close reading of the ordinary. And the ordinary, I mean the overlooked, the throwaways, and the stuff that is immediately accessible but usually tossed aside. And I really feel that this body of work that I'm about to show was very relevant to driving around with Julie over the course of the morning and the kind of things that I was seeing out of the window. So jumping straight into what is at stake at the work, I asked the questions: what is the ordinary, and why is the ordinary relevant now? The ordinary is what I've termed as the contractor stockpile. It's all of the things pertaining to the roof, and the lingo goes something like this: eaves, ridges, dormers, soffits, gables, hips, valleys, rakes. One of the literary references for the contractor stockpile is Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables, and the hashtag is domestic hats. If we consider the contractor as a geometrist for a moment, then it is possible to think about these piles of 2x6s and wood frame construction as a project of planar inclination. And I might go as far as to say that these geometries are the American version of the contemporary cathedral, which for purposes of the close reading was all about the roof. In the contractor stockpile, there are endless variations of the domestic roof pitch with slopes such as 3 to 12, 7 to 12, or 9 to 12. So this is a straightforward catalog of basic roof typologies: the shed, the dormer, the gable, the mansard, the hip. And they're so commonplace that we've overlooked the spatial possibilities that these roof types begin to produce when we flip our thinking about how they might affect the project of interiority. Current modes of construction from the contractor camp promote building vented roofs, yet the unvented version on this side allows for a visual connection to what's otherwise kind of just attic geometry. What happens in the attic stays in the attic, and you never see the underbelly in the vented roof condition. On the other hand, I'd like to be very clear about what I'm not interested in the project of the ordinary. I'm not interested in how these generic roofs have become the developer's tool for covering sprawling floor plans for large suburban single-family houses, as seen in the example on the right. Rather, I'm curious about the leftover results, the formal qualities. When they're mashed up, they misalign and result in awkward forms. The floor plan, roof plan overlay that I have right here on the left you can see that the diagonal seams indicate where the roof plan expands and receives another roof. So basically it's the place where the bullion happens. And then the ridges, which are the solid lines here, they lengthen and shorten based on how far the reach is to the next roof. But I find this problematic because decisions are based on tending to the floor plan first and conceding that the roof plan would follow. And these tendencies attenuate the possibility of the roof plan. All of the disciplinary questions tell me that the age-old problem of the roof is not going away, and I think we're going to grapple with this for a few more centuries to come. So in the next 8 slides, this is going to be kind of laborious, but I'm going to demonstrate what I mean by close reading and offer a formal analysis of these kind of banal forms. Figure 1 demonstrates how a gable roof is covered by a hip roof. Figure 2, there are 2 intersected gables here with an offset and misaligned shed roof. Figure 3, there's a chamfered triple hips with asymmetrically extruded gables. And then I want to look at this one a bit longer because I think there's a lot of things going on here. So we have asymmetrical triple gables, so 1, 2, 3. And then we've got this shed roof kind of squeezed in between, maybe gable 2 and 3. And then there's also 2 perpendicular gables stacked, and they're rotated. They're perpendicular to these ones I'm picking out. And then we have the dormer. Figure 5, we have stacked, stretched, and clipped gables, also known as the gable stack. Figure 6, piggybacked hip dormer nested onto 2 bullioned gables. Are y'all all seeing what I'm seeing? It's in there. You got to just really read it closely. Figure 7, intersecting gables, scaled, doubled, rotated, and then stacked. You can get really fancy with the words too. And then I'll end with this one. Front-facing gable with a camel-backed hip roof, because it's in the back, plus a rotated gable, so it's rotating out of that. And then a mini gable bump in the very, very back. So this was one from Los Angeles. Yeah, but these are everywhere. And if these all represent the contractor's stockpile of possibilities, the project I'm about to show, Domestic Hats, is the first design project where I'm looking closely at the ordinary, but wanting to deviate from these standards. The research began by taking a fairly random sample of 50 houses in the city of Atlanta, and it was cut through approximately 8 neighborhoods. And we started to notice a few tendencies about the collection. First, that the roof geometry in the more affluent neighborhoods, such as Virginia Highlands, were more convoluted, they were elaborate and complex, while the lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, such as Old Fourth Ward, appeared to have more humble roof lines. So you can just kind of see this one is from Buckhead probably, and this is probably from Cabbagetown. Yeah, the same thing. You see the simplicity versus the complexity. So yeah, I think in this case there's kind of 8 different roof typologies mashed up to cover a 6,000 square foot house plan. And as the recipient of the Young Architects Forum's Emerging Voices Award, we were asked to make a solo exhibition in this gallery space. It's 10,000 square feet, and we needed to kind of fill it in some way. And so the result are 16 large massing models measuring 3 foot by 5 foot by 3 foot in height. And what we call the mega massing model, and it's 12 feet by 20 feet by 6 feet in height. And this is kind of what we made. So these are our proposals. This one's called Hips, Gables, Dormers, A-frame, Sheds, and Mansards combined in 6 parts. In this massing, we intentionally included 6 different roof types and a 6-square grid to see how a larger organizational device might prompt unauthorized valleys and ridges. This one is called radial hips with minimum and maximum ridge lines. And it's a way of distorting the original found combination of hip roofs. And in this massing, the ridge lines are no longer parallel to the floor planes. This is the iconic gable front with 11 exploded miniature gables in the back. This one's hip roofs with oblique cuts and shifted valleys. And then 2 sets of incrementally scaled gables with aligned and misaligned camelback. So I'm taking some of the clues from the close reading that I just showed a minute ago. And questions came up like, what happens when an A-frame no longer produces a snug fit to an adjoining gable? You get kind of conditions like this. Or when a hip roof no longer sits symmetrically as the primary volume. Orientation still matters when working on the ordinary, but large roof surfaces respond much differently than small, densely packed, inward-looking roof surfaces. So these are all 16 domestic cats from a top view. And the representation, the orthographic representational agenda for the project follows 2 axonometric drawings for each of the 16 models. Yet they demonstrate differently in each one. So one axon engages the very top of the roof as a single razzle-dazzle surface. And then these represent vectors that were required to cut the foam model on our 4-axis wire cutter. And so we're kind of drawing some of the ways in which we were actually cutting and slicing the material. Domestic Hats also rethinks the role of massing model in architectural representation. So massing models are usually small in size, and they result from an iterative design process by the architect, and we know these kind of examples by OMA and Herzog-de-Meuron. They represent the schema, the diagram, or the proto-architecture. But lacking detail and often made out of a singular material, massing models distinguish differences in a volumetric study. Let's make it slightly thinner, no, a little longer, or better yet, let's make it fatter. But this project delights in the tendencies to engage multiples. It rejects the constraints of smallness. And so for these purposes, the models are actually scaled up to an awkward size, but without the detail. So they weren't kind of transportable, and they didn't fit in our cars. They wouldn't fit on a client's coffee table conference table. And so the opening night, we used spotlights to spot each of the 16 models. And so there was this interesting effect where sometimes the top surface of the roof was lit up and the faces or the elevations were in shadow, and sometimes the elevations were lit. So several of the domestic hats were removed from the gallery and taken back out into the city, and they were dropped off as yard art on the front lawns of the original houses that they were sampled during the research phase. Okay, so these neighborhood friends began to show off the novel forms of the ordinary when positioned next to standard gables and hips and dormers. And just as the plywood has been sheathed over the wood framing, the contractor's stockpile is operating at its best. Domestic hats found sitting on the front porch meets its match in the real one-to-one example of the overscaled massing model. So In conclusion, all of that work is now being turned into a project which is a single-family house called House Gables. And it's at a very small site. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's 18 feet wide by 55 feet in length. It's in Atlanta, and it looks at the combination of combining 6 gables together. This is a worm's eye view looking up at those gable combinations. These are the 4 primary facades. And we think that we're trying to also challenge a few paradigms here. We all know the free plan, the ROM plan, and maybe there should be something like the roof plan that sets up the diagram for how we design. This is off to a client meeting, lots of facade studies being looked at. And then in terms of working out the interior and exterior materials, we're working in the tradition of Southern faux finishing, and so you'll see things hopefully where fake terrazzo is a vinyl, it's not real terrazzo, or OSB board becomes a ceramic tile, or marble is not a marble, it's a drawing on a ceramic tile. Also, it's going to be built out of CLT, cross-laminated timber, and so I'm kind of at this point in the project where I'm looking at the ordinary, but I'm trying to remove the main structural piece that happens in a gable, and trying to figure out how much of it is really the ordinary and how much of it is relying on new kind of wood technology that is already being used in the UK. Okay, 2 more projects. How are we doing on time? Is it okay? Okay. So this one's called Best Sandwiches, and I think it's your poster out in the hallway, which was exciting to see. And it's following this lineage after domestic cats. And it's, again, hacking architectural types. And so in this project, the question that I'm asking is the problem of the extrusion. So it's a design and research project that is in search of novel spatial stacks, so architecture that stacks, and we have lots of examples of that in history. Maybe extrusion is a word linked to rhino, I'm not really sure, but I guess the point is that how can we have different volumetric I guess floors or spaces being stacked on top of each other. And the sandwich, I call it a BLT, that caught our eye the most was MVRDV's proposal for the Hanover Expo in 2000, where I think literally this looks like lettuce, there's like plant life growing, there's a layer of cheese, this kind of looks like a tomato. I don't know if y'all can see these buns that are happening. So we pulled a series of contemporary and historic examples and figuring out, oh, is this really a sandwich or is this more of a cake? Or, we were trying to figure out what was in and what was out. And so the crossed out ones are ones that didn't make the cut. Lots of Herzog and de Meuron projects I noticed. This is one proposal wasn't built by Valerio Olgiati, the Perm Museum. And this is the result of that research project. And like domestic cats, I'm sure it's going to find itself a life in a building very soon. This is at the Pink Coma Gallery in Boston. Very, very tiny space, an architecture gallery that promotes showing the work of young architects in the city. And these are 3D printed models. One goal here was also to use color in a kind of demonstrative way. And so how can you make 3D prints not look like 3D prints using something called flocking. It's like an arts and crafts method. This is, we were obviously looking at all the different sandwich typologies beyond the historic architecture examples. So this is probably what I would call the sub-sandwich. A series of drawings which then kind of separates out all the layers. And so if you start to think about designing in terms of stacks or layers and then how those layers come together, This is a I didn't even know this was a sandwich. It's called a dagwood. Then you get into all the research of every city across the U.S. tries to claim their own best sandwich version, like the Philly cheesesteak, or, everyone has their favorite, if it's a grilled cheese, or we also put hamburger in there, I think. I don't know if that really counts. Oh, and I just want to go back to one thing. So the pedestals in the gallery were a riff on Mies van der Rohe's use of chromium-plated cruciform columns that he uses in the Barcelona pavilion. And in this case, it was about making a faux chrome column. So the dimensions are quite similar. And in Mies's case, his columns were probably about reflection or spatial effects. And in this case, we're trying to use faux finishes in a deliberate way. In this case, the column, as we all know, is an extrusion of the same geometry. We're cutting it off with this platter, and we're putting stacked architecture on top. Again, trying to show a shift maybe in a paradigm. So this is the last project, and I wanted to end on a project that's very much tied to my teaching. When I was teaching at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And so this was a graduate design and research studio where I worked with students for an entire year, the first semester in a studio sequence and the second in a seminar. And for me, it was about being able to be back in the South after I'm originally from Alabama, and had been away for a decade, and so I was super excited about what that meant to be teaching and practicing in Atlanta. But before getting into the guidebook, I want to set something up and to look outside the discipline of architecture to talk about one of the biggest rivalries in the hip-hop industry. So in the mid-90s, as I'm sure you all know, Sean Combs ran Bad Boy Records on the East Coast, and on the West Coast, Suge Knight managed Death Row Records. And at that time, from lyrical retaliation to drive-by shootings, fan bases on both sides took part. Artists in New York, such as Biggie Smalls, were considered lyrists and prolific MCs. Out in Los Angeles, Tupac and Dr. Dre represented the real. And their lyrics were steeped in pain and violence, focused listeners on the social injustice that was associated with the LA riots at the time and the infiltration of crack cocaine. And so with all eyes on New York and Los Angeles, down south, hip-hop artists Goody Mob and Outkast had an alternate story to tell. They were operating as outliers, and they were first considered backwoods with slow Southern lyrics. But as record sales exceeded the New York, LA powerhouses, the Dirty South became known as the Third Coast. Inside the discipline of architecture, this well-established geographic and stylistic divide also exists. Instead of Sean Combs, we could say that architect and theorist Peter Eisenman probably runs the East Coast label, and we can imagine someone like Sylvia Lavin running the West Coast label. And these are the East Coast lyrists. They're the theorists, they're the architects writing text we still read a couple of decades later. The West Coast architecture clan represents the real. These guys are the makers. Their architecture is extremely dedicated to advancing a discourse about making and form. But the point here is not to identify who the architects of the Dirty South are, but rather ask the question, what is architecture of the Dirty South? How might we redirect the tension away from the East and West Coast? And can architects take clues from Atlanta-based artists, Outkast and Goody Mob? And so these are all the questions that I posed to students. And there were 14 graduate students in 2013 and 2014, and there were 12 women and 2 men. And they were studying architecture as a group of thinkers, writers, misbehaving makers, and storytellers to produce this guidebook for the city of Atlanta. So, guides are never neutral. They possess authority. Go here, see this, eat that. And beyond the power of persuasion, it's a representational media where there's a lineage of architects who have also closely looked at cities to develop new ways of making architecture. And so we were trying to follow their lead. And I'm talking about people like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown and Learning from Las Vegas. It's not a guidebook, but it's definitely reading the city in a particular way. Margaret Crawford's Everyday Urbanism, Rainer Banham Loves Los Angeles, and Koolhaas's Delirious New York. Early in the research phase, I asked the studio to question the structure of a traditional guidebook. There's typical categories like accommodation, shopping, attractions, and we began to cross out the original titles and proposed a range of topics that reclaim a regional identity by telling an alternative story to Atlanta. And so shopping gets crossed out, and so we're not taking tourists to the mall, we're taking them to the United States Post Office Mail-in Recovery Center, where all of our nation's lost and found mail shows up, and it goes on sale in an auction every month. This is just outside of Atlanta. And we're not showing glossy photos of Centennial Olympic Park or the aquarium, but instead we're pointing tourists or participants to see how there's an awkward history of architecture and urban patterns in the city, as seen here in something called Falk Art Park, which is nothing more than kind of a capped intersection over a downtown connector. Or how formerly abandoned surface parking lots, such as this one, is now home to Wheat Street Gardens, which is very close to the office of where Martin Luther King Jr. Was working. So this is more of a B-side tour. The guidebook celebrates the idiosyncratic architecture of Atlanta and what probably the East and West Coasts might otherwise overlook and deem as backwoods. So there's a tour section. We record real sites, places that really exist in the city, and fictional places where the students put forward ideas about what architecture of the city might become. This is a typical map. And I'll just walk through some of the chapters of the book. So this is a chapter on accommodations, and it's been renamed to The Average House by Kasia Zinchitsky. And here she's documenting 50 houses throughout the city, ranging from historical and modern homes to those found on Airbnb. And then she goes through and traces the section of these structures, and she explores an idea about what an average house in Atlanta might look like. And so the last kind of entry in each chapter appears to be another house to go see. There's an address, you can find it on the map, but in fact it's actually fictional. It's a student project. You then open up the book to this kind of centerfold, and you find more drawings by the student in that section. So Liz Teston points readers to the importance of Atlanta being the birthplace of the Dirty South hip-hop movement. And in a chapter titled Landmarks, her initial research involved mapping over 70 hip-hop song lyrics by marking their geographical location within the city. And it became apparent that in songs such as Goody Mob's 1995 Soul Food track, lyrics were directly linked to the places where the band members lived in Southwest Atlanta neighborhood. So JJ's Rib Shack, the Texaco, 1365 Wichita Drive, and Apple Tree Homes were documented in this kind of never seen before map of Campbellton Road. In a chapter dedicated to architecture tours of the city, Patrick DeVoe's research sifts through old postcards of Atlanta, and this led him to the strange realization that not only does Atlanta have a history in demolition, as we all know, from the Civil War, but he found multiple cases where buildings' facades were torn down, stored, and then moved to other location, and he calls this chapter Facade Trafficking. So all the black with white lines, part of the buildings, those have actually been parts of facades that have been moved and put somewhere else in the city. And so this is his project, looking at how to reuse those on a small site in downtown. And so just as the guidebook was going to go to print in its draft version, we learned that I.M. Pei's first building was actually built in Atlanta in 1951, was being demolished, and we were kind of worried where it was going to go. Actually, they just took it down and then reassembled parts of its facade in the same site, and then put this became the clubhouse for an apartment complex. So I don't know, Pritzker Prize winning architects' buildings get torn down and reused. I don't know. I guess it's a good thing. So this is Ian Frolick's project, and he discovers a highly unusual space in Atlanta. He realized that if you track the path of a visitor from Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, you could take a plane train, you could then get on MARTA, you could arrive at Peachtree Center Station. This puts you out in the middle of John Portman's complex in downtown Atlanta, and you could meander through several of Portman's Atrium structures and also linked by sky bridges without ever stepping foot outdoors. So that there's technically, I think, 13 miles of quarantine space, and he's borrowing, in this case for his project, he's borrowing all the kind of sections from Portman's buildings. And he's making a proposal for a kind of super atria. And not many people on the West and East Coast know that in the American South, the birthplace of the super atrium took place as a typology. And now we find that type everywhere globally. And we just thought it was kind of interesting that this kind of project that he proposed, given its proximity to the Center for Disease and Control in Atlanta, I don't know, it's very kind of quarantined. And lastly, this is a chapter titled Escapes. Jennifer Lewis begins to look at the tops of skyscrapers in the city, and notice that 11 of these all have this pyramidal top to them. And so in her project, she proposes to cut them off. They would then be at the base of the building. They would become the new public art sculpture. And she proposes a new kind of architecture for the top, which kind of gives over space to the public in a kind of top floor urbanism, I think is what she called it. So in conclusion, A Guide to the Dirty South it's part tour guide, it's part architectural manual, it's an assemblage of found and sometimes imaginative stuff that attempts to be both reflective and projective about the city of Atlanta. And we are wondering if these ideas reflect a new reading on regionalism in architecture, and if so, we'd like it to be called Dirty South Regionalism. So thank you for your time. I know it's like the first 2 weeks in school, so you're really trying to get back into it, but you can ask anything about representation. Go ahead.
So it seems like in the work, there's attention to consumer culture and the ordinary, with the sensibility that in the ordinary, all kinds of unique tangents that can be kind of called out through interrogation, recontextualization. I was wondering if you could speak more about your working process in the studio. Whenever you begin to study something ordinary as something banal, at what point do you decide, that a massive model is going to fill a gallery, or you're going to look at the work of prominent architecture for the sandwich typology? There seems like a sense of openness with how those decisions can be made in the studio.
Yeah, so that's a good question that I don't know if I was really clear about, but representation is very closely linked to the architectural project that I'm working on. So like let's say in the sandwiches case, sandwiches are kind of small, right? So what I did is I just made them slightly larger so they didn't really look like sandwiches and they might look like buildings. And in the domestic cats case, you know, I was just interested in the way that typically firms and practices use massing models to just do a quick sketch or a quick idea, but I was like, no, why can't we make this the kind of primary way to look at architecture? And so when I showed the development of House Gables, I still showed you no windows. It was still like, looked like a massing model. And I think it's important to look at that for a little while before jumping straight into material selection or tectonics. But I will admit that I'm in a little bit of a bind because on the House Gables project, I'm still trying to make it look like a massing model, but then you got to deal with the eaves, you got to deal with the gutters. Do I try to look like a Swiss architect and hide it all? Do I bring back the ordinary? So there's a lot of tectonic questions that I'm asking right now, which is different to the setup that I originally took on when looking at the types.
Well, maybe it's an observation, and I guess I'd like you to maybe elaborate on it. I was really, there's a theme that runs through the work that I'm really sympathetic to, perhaps because I am also a little familiar with it. When you were making the architectural comparisons to East and West Coast, it's really clear that when you have someone like Scott Moore or Stan Allen or like that, kind of under this sort of figure, someone like Eisenberg, there's a kind of established culture within the architectural world that has to do with like that, where they were educated, the presence of Ivy League institutions. It's all about a particular way to look at it. And we can engage it, and these people have conversations all the time. And there's a very similar thing that happens on the West Coast. There's a kind of formal extravagance that might come from LA, might actually have something to do with Hollywood, that kind of says it's not intellectual, but in fact there's a really highly intellectual component. The thing that I want to observe with your presentation is that there is actually a real culture of this kind of way of working in architecture in the South.
Yes.
Whether we're talking about Sam Motley or Max Scott and Carolina or Chris Richer, who was a kind of intellectual guru behind them. Marvin Blackwell comes out of that tradition, which we know. And so this isn't, in a way, kind of strangeness for the sake of strangeness. It's actually a kind of cultural movement, at least among some architects working within that region. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there's many directions that I could go. I mean, first to say, I'm glad you agree that there's this kind of binary between the two coasts. Also, I was looking at the conceptual artists Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt. I think they were actually married, but they did this film called East Coast, West Coast, where they staged this fake interview amongst themselves. And Nancy Holt's acting like the uptight New York artist who needs diagrams and drawings and a plan before she can operate. And Smithson's like acting like the laid-back California artist that's like, you just got to feel it, you got to just let it go. And so they were playing to the stereotypes that I've also kind of laid out here. And so I think it's interesting that it also happens in art, it happens in rap, it happens in all these different cultural activities around us. And so, I mean, I guess my main strategy when I was teaching the studio, or what I'm trying to continue to do, is just to raise a discourse and to make a little bit of noise around a different geographic region. and not by doing it with the star architects. I mean, I did do it a little bit where I showed Mockbee and Mack and Merrill's work today, but I guess also trying to find out how to work myself, even though I might be on the East Coast right now, and then what I guess is close to home, or what the heritage or the lineage is in these Southern architects. What else could I say about it? I don't know. So the other thing is that I was a student at Auburn, and I was at the Rural Studio. I don't know if you all know that. It's a design build program started by Sam Mockbee, and he died the year I was making my thesis project. And so since my experiences in Europe and graduate school at the East Coast, I've always been wondering, what do I do with this situation that Mockbee put us in as students? I kind of have Mockbee's, I feel like on my shoulder going, what are you going to do, Jennifer? And it's not to make another design build program, but it is to think about maybe a different kind of school that could come out of the South, maybe Atlanta, Does anyone, do you feel this like East Coast, West Coast? Y'all are in Lubbock, which is kind of in the middle. It's like the ordinary architecture that I saw, from Julie's car was just amazing. The industrial, big roofs buildings. I don't even know what to call them or what I was looking at, but.
One last question?
Sure. So I actually was pretty intrigued throughout the whole presentation as to how you kind of took this approach to, I guess, a regionalist appeal of things and seeing what the cultural adaptive approach of these processes were. And like a lot of what is kind of profound is looking at like interdisciplinary study, like looking at the group study and how it had to do with socioeconomics, or looking at the example had to do with hip hop culture. It's really profound to me, because a lot of the times when we think ordinary, we think it's set from a precedent of previous ordinary architecture. Mm-hmm. So I suppose in looking at a place like Lubbock, for instance, how would you feel would be maybe a technique to approach this sort of experimentation of what could be a new sense of reinterpreting the ordinary in a place like this, where we don't necessarily have this significant, I wouldn't say significant, but familiar sense of what is, I guess, what you see in the West Coast or the East Coast, right? Something that you can identify with.
Yeah, you don't have a bunch of buildings in your backyard to go look at and study in terms of like canonical buildings, right? Or like noteworthy architecture. I'm making a stereotype, but that it might be true, but I'm just saying. So what I would say is that these, I don't even know what to call them, industrial, agricultural types, they didn't look like barns. They look like, somebody tell me what they're, cotton sheds. There must be more than just cotton.
Silos, cotton sheds.
Yeah. Julie pointed out like a black water tower. I was like, why is it black? It's beautiful. So I think it's, so I don't know. Is it dangerous to do a formal reading of these things and look at all their details? Do we try to make buildings constructed like that on a smaller scale? Do we, maybe there's like some history theory people here, but there was a conversation about the vernacular that happened a couple of decades ago. I don't think that we should go in that route, or we should be aware of what was kind of determined or said during that time. I think it has to do with but I guess what I'm promoting in all this is have a close look at something. So study it, know it, and then you got to flip it. You can't replicate it. You got to push it further, I think.
Yeah, I think if I can say something, I think one of the things is you have to kind of look for what a Mexican poet called the radical strangeness of it. And so one of the things that the group of architects that are kind of working within this mode are doing is kind of looking at the kind of radical strangeness of that ordinary, right? So whether it's a kind of naive art or or whether it's the kind of textbook or the composition book pattern, or whether they're really looking at it in that way. So it would be like it's like how Flannery O'Connor looks at how strange the South is. That the architecture can be doing that, I think. Right? So I don't know. I look at the industrial agricultural architecture, but then I'm over intellectualizing. But I read Cormac McCarthy, right? And the strangeness that he saw in this landscape, and its harshness and its weirdness at the same time.
Thanks.
Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie.